There are voices that belong to stadiums, voices that fill every corner of a room, every hollow in a crowd, every inch of open sky above an outdoor stage. Jim Morrison had one of those voices. And on most nights, the world heard exactly what it expected: the thunder, the poetry, the command, the danger. But there was one night, inside a recording studio in Los Angeles, when the world heard nothing at all. Because what happened in that room was never meant to leave it. The producer who witnessed it kept the secret for a very long time. Not out of fear, not out of loyalty to a label or a contract, but because some moments belong only to the person who lived them, and the one who happened to be standing close enough to see. This is the story of that night, and it begins not in a studio, but in the silence that always preceded Jim Morrison's loudest hours. By the autumn of 1969, Jim Morrison was one of the most recognizable figures in American music. The Doors had released 4 studio albums. Their name was printed on marquees from Los Angeles to New York. Morrison's face had appeared on the covers of magazines that did not normally concern themselves with rock and roll. He had been arrested, written about, studied, celebrated, and condemned, sometimes all in the same week. He was 25 years old. But the version of Jim Morrison that the public had assembled from photographs and concert footage and breathless reviews was, in the way that all public versions of complicated people are, incomplete. There was a man behind the image. A man who woke up in the mornings with the same weight everyone carries. A man who understood, perhaps better than most, the distance between what the world saw and what actually lived inside him. And that distance, through the summer and into the fall of that year, had been growing. The recording sessions for what would eventually become the album known as Morrison Hotel were not going the way anyone had hoped. The band was still there. Ray Manzarek at the keys, Robbie Krieger on guitar, John Densmore behind the drums. The chemistry that had produced some of the most distinctive rock music of the decade was still present in the room, still audible in the way they listened to each other, the way they moved through a chord change together. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Something quiet and difficult to name, the way weather changes before you can see the clouds. Morrison was arriving late, or sometimes not arriving at all, and then appearing hours after the scheduled session with an energy that the people around him had learned to read carefully. There were good nights and difficult nights. There were sessions where the music came easily, where everything locked together and the tape rolled, and what emerged felt inevitable. And there were other sessions, longer, darker, harder, where nothing seemed to reach him. But no one had seen what the producer saw on the night this story is about. Not his bandmates, not his manager, not the engineers who moved quietly around the edges of those sessions, adjusting levels and threading tape, and pretending not to notice the tension in the room. What happened that night was witnessed by one man, and he carried it in the way people carry the things that change them. The session had begun in the early evening. The plan was to work on a track that had been giving the band trouble, a piece that kept reaching for something it had not yet found, a shape that was almost right but not quite. The arrangement was solid. The performances were technically sound, but every time they played it back, something was missing. The kind of something that cannot be fixed with a different microphone placement or a new guitar tone. The kind of something that lives inside the person singing. Morrison had been quiet that evening. Not the theatrical quiet of a performer building toward a moment. This was different. A stillness that seemed to come from somewhere below the surface. He had arrived on time, which was itself unusual enough to register. He had sat in the corner of the control room while the engineers prepared the session. a notebook open on his knee. But he was not writing. He was looking at something on the page that he had already written, reading it the way people reread things they do not fully understand yet. No one spoke to him. The people who worked in those rooms had learned when to speak and when to leave the air alone. When the band was ready, Morrison walked into the live room and stood at the microphone. The engineer rolled the tape. The band came in together, clean and precise, and Morrison opened his mouth, and what came out was not the performance anyone was expecting. It was not bad. It was not broken. It was something harder to describe than either of those things. It was as if the words he was singing had stopped being words and become something more direct, something that moved through the chest rather than through the mind. The band felt it. They exchanged glances over the tops of their instruments, the kind of glances that ask a question without words. They kept playing, because that is what musicians do when something unexpected happens in a room and the tape is still rolling. And then Morrison stopped. Not at the end of a phrase, not at a natural pause in the music. He simply stopped in the middle of a line and stood at the microphone without moving. The band trailed off one instrument at a time, the way music dies when the center leaves it. Through the glass of the control room, the producer watched. He did not reach for the intercom. He did not speak. He understood, in the way that people who have spent years in recording studios understand, that what was happening in that room was not a problem to be solved. Morrison stood at the microphone for a long moment. His head was slightly bowed. His hands were at his sides. And then, very quietly, without drama, without performance, his shoulders moved. He was weeping. Not the demonstrative grief of someone who wants to be seen, not the collapse of a man losing control. It was something smaller and more private than either of those things. A quiet dissolution. A man, alone at a microphone, in a room that was supposed to be about music, finally setting down something he had been carrying for a very long time. The producer did not move. He turned off the talkback so that his own breathing would not intrude. He let the room be what it needed to be. Later, when he was asked, not in interviews because he did not give interviews about this, but in private conversation, years afterward, he would say that it was the most honest thing he had ever witnessed in a recording studio. Not the most technically accomplished, not the most musically extraordinary, the most honest. And in music, he said, honesty is the thing that all the technique in the world is trying to reach.